जी सर ने रिपीट के
The total slide. I told you that gases move by diffusion under partial pressure gradient. Whenever there is difference between the partial pressures, from higher area, high pressure area, the gas will diffuse out into the low pressure area. Since at the alveolar level in the lungs, oxygen is more, because it's a fresh air having more oxygen, pure oxygen. Oxygen is more in the alveolar area and having much partial pressure as compared to the blood. That's why oxygen from the capillary area will ooze out into the, oxygen from the pulmonary area in the alveoli will ooze out into the capillaries. Capillary blood kaun se wala hai? It is that blood which has been deoxygenated by the tissues and now brought back to the lungs for oxygenation. So looking at the diagram, the topmost area, alveolar PO2 is 104 millimeters of mercury. This is the fresh air brought from the atmosphere to the lungs, to the alveoli. Now, the moment it comes near the capillary area, there is abrupt diffusion of the gases, of oxygen I mean, and the pulmonary capillary oxygen also gets equalized with the alveolar area. That is, from 40 millimeters of mercury, the pressure goes to 104 millimeters of mercury by the time it reaches the other end of the capillary. So it is so quick. Hopefully you understood it now, that within no time, the equilibrium is attained. That is, the pressure in the pulmonary area is also now 104 millimeters of mercury. Now this pressure, this blood with 104 millimeters of mercury is now fit to be supplied to the tissues. But first it has to be brought to the heart, left chamber of the heart, so that it can be expelled in the form of cardiac output to the whole body. Now inside the heart, the pressure is not the same as that in the pulmonary area, and it is not 104 millimeters of mercury. Why? Because during passage to the pulmonary areas, the pulmonary venous blood also mixes with it, which is deoxygenated blood. That blood which is required for the pulmonary needs, for the metabolism of the pulmonary tissues. So that blood has never passed to those capillaries which are at the alveolar level. That's why they are not oxygenated. It remains deoxygenated. Now this deoxygenated blood, though in very meager quantity, when it mixes with the fresh blood of 104 millimeters of mercury partial pressure, it reduces the pressure from 104 to 95 millimeters of mercury. This is called admixture. This is actually mixing up of the pure blood coming from the pulmonary alveolar area with the venous blood which is coming from the pulmonary tissues. I hope you got this point. So you can now imagine that blood coming to the aorta and going on for circulation in the arterial system to be supplied to the tissues that contains now 95 millimeters mercury partial pressure. This is the partial pressure. Remember, and content of oxygen is something else. The total amount of oxygen present in a definite amount of the blood that we should discuss later on. So you can also see in the lower part of the diagram that blood PO2, partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, which was deoxygenated by the tissues, that to start with, it was 40 millimeters of mercury. And it goes up the red line and reaches the alveolar oxygen partial pressure level of 104, which later on becomes 95 because of the admixture with the venous pulmonary blood. Now, in this way, oxygen from the lungs is sent to the tissues, and carbon dioxide from the tissues is brought back to the lungs after being picked up by the blood in the tissues. This diagram, if you look at it, also tells you the same story, that systemic venous blood, the blood which is coming from the tissues, the first block on the left side, that is having oxygen concentration of 40. For any partial pressure of the oxygen is 40 millimeters of mercury. And this goes to the pulmonary areas, pulmonary capillaries, where it attains the same partial pressure as that of the alveolar area, that is 104 millimeters of mercury. But due to admixture of the pulmonary venous blood with it, the partial pressure drops down to 95 millimeters of mercury. You can see the drop mixed with pulmonary shunt blood, जहाँ पे लिखा है, just below it is the partial pressure level of 95. And this when then comes to the tissues, systemic circulation, systemic capillaries in the tissues, oxygen is being used up and the partial pressure of the oxygen drops back to 40 millimeters of mercury. I think it's easy diagram and very clear as well. You must have understood it, inshallah. Next, going to the next slide. Now, tissues normally use very less oxygen for metabolism, while at rest, the tissues use very little oxygen, that is 1 to 2 millimeters of mercury pressure is sufficient with a great, but here there is a great margin of 23. So we are always on the safe side. Everywhere, oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged in the opposite direction. The only difference is that carbon dioxide is much quicker, much faster. It is 20 times faster as compared to the lazy oxygen. This means that less partial pressure difference is required for carbon dioxide. Slight difference of partial pressure is needed so that the carbon dioxide is pushed to the other side and transferred to the other side as compared to the oxygen. Now at lung level, the difference is only 5 millimeters of mercury, which means that 45 is in the blood, the oxygen level, 45 millimeters of mercury, while 40 is in the alveoli. Normally 97% oxygen is transported by hemoglobin and 3% is in the dissolved form. 97% is transported by hemoglobin, while the remaining 3% is in the dissolved form. And also remember that the dissolved form of the oxygen contributes to the partial pressure. not the oxygen which is bound with hemoglobin. Only the partial pressure is only because of the dissolved part. Oxygen has to be, the 97% oxygen has to be carried by the hemoglobin. A slight review of the molecular structure of the hemoglobin. If you can see the diagram, the flower I have made it for you. This ordinary pansy, जिसको गुलाब बेनफ्शा भी कहते हैं. Now the 4 petals are the 4 pyrrole rings of the hemoglobin. And the central part where the iron is lodged in the form of ferrous form, to these iron 4 pyrrole rings are attached. The pyrrole rings you can imagine they are the seats for the oxygen. So 4 pyrrole rings, if all are oxygenated, it means 100% oxygenation. Everyone gets 25% share. 25%. So when we say that hemoglobin is fully saturated 100%, it means all the 4 seats are occupied by the oxygen. And if 3 seats are occupied by the oxygen and 1 remains as such, then we say 75% saturation of the hemoglobin. And similarly, 50% saturation of the hemoglobin if 2 are occupied by the oxygen and 2 are lying as such. Partial pressure in the alveoli is 100 millimeters of mercury, while partial pressure in the blood is 40 millimeters of mercury. There is a huge difference of 60 millimeters of mercury. And increase in the partial pressure causes more binding of oxygen with the hemoglobin and the reverse. If the partial pressure is more, there will be full saturation of the hemoglobin, that is 100%. And if the partial pressure difference is less, then saturation will also be less. It will not be 100%. Routinely and normally, at partial pressure of 40, which is present in the venous blood, which has been brought back to the pulmonary area for oxygenation, the partial pressure here is 40, and we have found it that at 40, 3 pockets of the hemoglobin are already filled. In the hemoglobin, the blood which is returning from the tissues, only 25% oxygen has been given to the tissues. The rest, 75%, is brought back. So you can say that this hemoglobin, this blood which has been brought to the pulmonary area for oxygenation is already having 75% saturation, which means that hemoglobin returns to the lungs from the tissues only for 25% oxygen, because only 1 seat is available that has to be filled to make it 100% saturation. I hope you got my point. वो blood जो कि tissues से वापस आ रहा है oxygenation के लिए, already उसमें 75% oxygen मौजूद है. सिर्फ 25% यानी 1 seat, 1 pocket जो खाली है of the hemoglobin pockets में, 4 pockets हैं hemoglobin के for oxygen, each one having 25% oxygen. So it comes back to the lungs for full saturation to get 100% saturation. Per trip, it means that it is getting only 25% hemoglobin. Now, from 100 pressure in the alveoli to 40, which is pressure in the pulmonary blood, oxygen diffuses urgently and fills up the last portion, available portion in the hemoglobin as well. The partial pressure of blood also equalizes with the alveoli, and both are now at equilibrium for partial pressure, so no further diffusion. Equilibrium has been attained, and it is 104 already in the alveoli, and it has become 104 in the pulmonary capillaries as well. By now, we say that hemoglobin is fully saturated, that is 100%. All the pockets, all the seats reserved for oxygen are filled up. We also know from our experiments that 1 gram of hemoglobin can carry 1.34 ml of oxygen. Now, this is the quantity of oxygen. 1.34 ml of oxygen is carried by 1 gram of the hemoglobin. And since a normal person is having 15 grams of the hemoglobin in 100 ml of blood, so if you calculate that how much oxygen will be there in the 100 ml of blood, that is 15 gram hemoglobin. If you multiply it 1.34 with 15, it comes to 20 ml of oxygen. It's a bit more than 20 ml, 20 point something, but the admixture, if you remember, at the pulmonary level, it comes to 20 ml of oxygen. The partial pressure of oxygen in pulmonary vein, that is the left heart, drops to 95, as I told you just now, due to admixture. Now, in this way, oxygen is brought back to the tissues from the pulmonary area. Now, this oxygen, this blood, when it goes to the tissues, it has to be delivered to the tissues, but the delivery is not that simple as one should think. If you see at the left side diagram, logically, if the y-axis shows the percent saturation and the baseline, that's the X line, shows the partial pressure of the oxygen. Now, as you go towards the 100% saturation, and this oxygen has to be delivered. So if you decrease the partial pressure, the baseline, from the right side and going towards the zero, the left side, then the curve should be linear. As the pressure decreases, the dissociation means the release of oxygen. Dissociation means dissociation between the hemoglobin and oxygen. जितना dissociation कम होता जाएगा, more oxygen will be released. लेकिन actually the graph is not like that, because the quality of the hemoglobin changes in different conditions. Hemoglobin normally, if you say that it loves oxygen at one point, at another point, For example, at the tissue level, it may not love it. इसकी मिसाल आप यूं लें कि your father goes to the market to fetch fruits for you. He goes to the market where fruits are available और वहाँ पे वो कोशिश करता है कि जितना ज्यादा संभाल ले, जितने ज्यादा पॉकेट्स हैं उसके सब भर ले आपके लिए. When he comes back to the house to deliver it to you, तो उसकी affinity उन fruits के साथ इतनी कम हो जाती है that your father throws everything to deliver it to you. Similar is the case over here as well. Hemoglobin loves oxygen at the pulmonary area, so it gets its pockets full. And when it goes to the tissue area, where the conditions are different as compared to the pulmonary area, there it starts hating oxygen and starts to remove it, and instead takes carbon dioxide, which is produced by the tissues. That's why this changing attitude of hemoglobin at two different points, pulmonary area and the tissue area. The curve is not straight line, rather it is a sigmoid, as you can see on the right. And we will see it later on that with each decrease in the partial pressure, there should be some decrease in the affinity of the hemoglobin for oxygen. And the oxygen should be dissociated. That's why it is called dissociation curve. Now the first part, the topmost part, if you drop if you look at this diagram, the right one, self-made, at 100 partial pressure difference, the saturation of hemoglobin is also 100. On the left side, you can see from 0 it goes up to 100, and on the x-axis, the baseline pressure of oxygen goes up to 100. So both are at 100 each. Means at 100 partial pressure, hemoglobin has been 100% saturated. All the 4 pockets are filled up. So as you decrease the partial pressure from 100 to 80, means there is 20% reduction in the partial pressure. But if you look at the topmost area, the dissociation or the saturation is not by 20%, rather it will only be by 5%, 95. Means there is much drop in the pulse pressure, in the partial pressure, with less drop in the oxygen saturation. This is special feature of this curve. If you further decrease the pressure, for example, you have brought it to 50, now one would expect that the dissociation or dissaturation of the hemoglobin should also be 50%, but it's not like that. At 50, it is almost 85. Means only 15% dissociation. Means that the oxygen is still 85% with the hemoglobin. Hemoglobin does not want to lose it. But after that, the curve changes its direction and the conditions change so that for every drop in the partial pressure, there is much drop in the oxygen saturation as well of the hemoglobin, and there is much disassociation. वो affinity ऑक्सीजन वाली खत्म हो गई है हेमोग्लोबिन के साथ और हेमोग्लोबिन रिलीज कर रहा है ऑक्सीजन को in the later part of the curve when it drops very quickly. Now normally we exercise the upper part of the curve in which only the pressure drops to 85 the saturation, that 15 ml drop. But during exercises, when the muscles use a lot of oxygen and they produce a lot of carbon dioxide, the rest of the curve has to be applied. Where, which means that you have to drop the partial pressure of oxygen too much to get too much oxygen from the dissociation curve. आप यूं तस्वर कर लें कि there is a tree which is full of apples. जितना ये tree ऊंचा होगा, ये आपकी पहुंच से दूर होगा. As the tree bends towards the right side, तो कुछ इम्कानात आपके पैदा हो गए कि you may reach the fruit area. So when the curve goes down and to the right, it means it easily supplies oxygen and the dissociation is greater now. Dissociation of oxygen from the hemoglobin is greater when the curve shifts to the right and down. और जितना if it goes to the left, यानी दरख्त जितना लंबा होता जाएगा और सीधा खड़ा होगा, your chances of getting fruits is less. So here the same thing applies over here as well. The dissociation becomes difficult when the curve shifts to the left. It shifts to the left and it straightens a bit and it goes up. So these two conditions, shift of the curve to the right and shift of the curve to the left. When there is shift of the curve to the right, it means the dissociation is easy and at little pressure difference, much oxygen is made available to the tissues. And if it goes to the left, then you have to drop the pressure too much to get dissociation of oxyhemoglobin. Now, if you see and look at the left side diagram, shift to the right, the one with in the center, the red line, straight red line in the center, that is the normal. The lower dotted red line is shift to the right, and the upper or left side dotted line is a shift to the left. So certain conditions make the curve shift to the right. What are those conditions? Number one, increased hydrogen ions concentration. We will explain it later on. Increased CO2, increased temperature, increased BPG. It's one of the products, biphosphoglycerase. Now these four factors are easily available at the tissue level. In the tissues, there is increased production of the carbon dioxide, which mixes with the blood, and carbonic acid and hydrogen are released. So hydrogen area, the hydrogen in the area is increased, which shifts the curve to the right, bringing it to the right and down so that oxygen is easily taken from the hemoglobin, means the dissociation becomes greater. Dissociation between the oxygen and the hemoglobin becomes greater. Similarly, in tissues where carbon dioxide is more because of the metabolism, use up of the oxygen by the tissues, and production of the carbon dioxide, that also helps in bringing the curve to the right and down. With metabolism, there is increased temperature, and this also increases the shift to the right. And a chemical product, biphosphoglycerase, that also helps in bringing it to the right. So this right shifting is beneficial because at the tissue level, we will be able to grasp more carbon dioxide and release oxygen to the tissues easily. This is what happens to the hemoglobin at the tissue level, where it has come to deliver oxygen. Remember, it comes to the pulmonary area to get oxygen, and it goes to the tissue level to deliver that oxygen. Now, the reverse of all these, for example, if there is increase in the pH, means one goes towards the alkalinity, there is less hydrogen. Or if carbon dioxide is less produced because of less metabolism. And when less metabolism, there will be no increase in the temperature. So all these things, deficiency of all these will shift the curve to the left and up, means the dissociation becomes difficult. Rather, the affinity of oxygen for hemoglobin increases, and hemoglobin never releases oxygen so easily then. Now, this is the shift of this curve, oxyhemoglobin curve, to the right. Once in the center is the normal, to the right, the dissociation increases and it becomes easy to release oxygen. And when it goes to the left, it's the opposite way. The dissociation becomes difficult. Association increases. So oxygen is not readily allowed. Whenever there is more pressure, more oxygen will be bound with the hemoglobin. That is, there will be more saturation. Initially, pressure decreases, causes little decrease in the saturation. Now, we are talking regarding that curve. Initially, pressure decreases, cause a little decrease in the saturation. For example, if you decrease the partial pressure of oxygen to 50, for example, one would expect that 50% saturation, that there should be decrease in saturation by 50%, but it's not 50%, rather it's only 15%. That is, from 100, the saturation has come down to 85. Partial pressure आपने decrease कर लिया from 100 to 50. लेकिन ऑक्सीजन की hemoglobin की saturation from 100 से नीचे 85 तक आ गया, सिर्फ 15 का फर्क पड़ा, 50 तक नहीं गया. This is the upper portion of the curve, which we normally use during resting life. The last portion जो है uppermost, this is flat upper portion. It is operating during rest. Decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen to 40, and पार्शल प्रेशर पहले 50 तक ले आए हम, अब 40 तक ले गए कि 60% डिक्रीज कर दिया, लेकिन 60% सेचुरेशन में डिक्रीज नहीं होता, सेचुरेशन में सिर्फ 25% होता है. It means when the partial pressure of oxygen drops to 40 as at the venous side, the blood which is returning back to the lungs for oxygenation, उसमें 40 होता है, लेकिन saturation 40 लेवल पे नहीं है, saturation सिर्फ 25% डिक्रीज हुआ है, गोया कि 75% still saturated. वो hemoglobin which is coming back to the lungs for further oxygenation, it is already having 75% quota. So per trip it gains only 25%. Now this is during the resting conditions. But in exercise, when the metabolism of the tissues increases, when the tissues produce more temperature, when the tissues produce more carbon dioxide, all these things cause steep downward fall in the saturation. And there is much disassociation at the exercise level. We find this thing. When we are exercising, the muscles use more oxygen, produce more carbon dioxide, reduce more temperature, and so on. दूसरा फायदा उसका ये भी होता है एक्सरसाइज का कि actually the cardiac output is increased, and increased cardiac output brings more blood frequently, and the whole process is repeated very frequently. As I pointed earlier as well, that upper flat portion of the curve is hardly affected by much decrease in PO2. PO2 decrease होता है, लेकिन flat portion पे ज़्यादा असर नहीं पड़ता, because if flat भी इस वास्ते है कि the saturation does not decrease too much, लेकिन lower steep portion जो है that dissociates quickly by further slight decrease in the PO2. As stated earlier, PO2 dropped by 50%. यानी अगर हम partial pressure of oxygen 100 से वापस ले आए, partial pressure drop by 50%, 50 तक ले आए, it does not cause saturation drop by 50%. It only causes saturation drop by 15%. But further drop of the PO2 from 50 to 0, the saturation will go by 85%. यानी अब वो तेज हो गया. पहले 50 partial pressure हमने decrease किया, it caused only 15% dissociation. और आखिरी 50 जब हमने किया तो बजाय 15 बजाय 30 के there is 85% decrease. So remaining 85% है, that is also lost, dissociated. This was the portion exercise में इस्तेमाल होता है, that is the steep one, the lower portion. Now, as I stated earlier as well, that you can say that at high PO2, as you find in the pulmonary area, alveolar area, hemoglobin loves oxygen, while at low PO2, as in the high tissues, it hates oxygen. That's why it dissociates it and delivers it to the tissue. Instead, it takes up carbon dioxide, which means that hemoglobin changes its affinity at the two ends, two different ends. One is at the pulmonary end, where it has got more affinity for oxygen. And another is at the tissue level, where the affinity decreases too much and it dissociates oxygen quickly. You can also imagine that when 100% saturation of the hemoglobin, and when the level of the hemoglobin is also normal, that is 15 grams percent, it carries 20 ml of oxygen when hemoglobin is fully saturated, which means that is a pulmonary area. 75% saturation at 40 millimeter. When it means that at the tissue level, hemoglobin saturation from 100 comes down to 75%, which means that 25% of the oxygen has been delivered to the tissues. So the total content, which was 20, is now 15 at the tissue level. To make it once again 20, it has to come to the pulmonary area. So means that per trip, it gets only 5 ml or 25% saturation. 5 ml of oxygen or 25% saturation. 75% already iske paas tha, blood ke paas. In exercise, cardiac output increases by 6 times, which needs for cater for the needs. 6 times आपका cardiac output, जो कि 5 liters था per minute, वो increase हो जाता है. Partial pressure of the oxygen in the tissues drops from 40 to 15 millimeters of mercury due to increased metabolism. This we have already discussed, how the increased amount of oxygen is delivered. Exercising muscles get more oxygen due to increased cardiac output and also due to increased dissociation. Exercising muscles दोनों इस्तेमाल करते हैं, availability of more blood, cardiac output, and also increased dissociation, quick disposal of the hemoglobin, of the oxygen by the hemoglobin. Now, एक term है P50. P50 means partial pressure 50. So partial pressure of oxygen, P50 means partial pressure of oxygen, for example, at which 50% of the hemoglobin is saturated and 50% is not saturated. Means the 4 pockets, each having 25% of oxygen in one pocket, in another, so it 4 make 100% saturation. So if the 2 are vacant and 2 are having oxygen, means hemoglobin is 50% saturated, then we say it is the P50. It is that partial pressure at which half of the hemoglobin is saturated and half is non-saturated. This is probably a repetition that with increased acidity, increased temperature, increased cardiac output, and increased 2,3 BPG, all these factors cause increased dissociation. Or increased dissociation means no or less love of the hemoglobin for the oxygen. So it pushes out the hemoglobin. इस वास्ते इसको dissociation curve का नाम दिया है. The curve is shifted to the right and it is brought a bit down. जैसे मैंने दरख्त की मिसाल दी थी कि उसकी शाखें अगर नीचे आए, you may be able to get more fruits out of it. Similarly, when the curve shifts to the right, आप इस तरह याद रखें कि it releases then oxygen quickly and easily as compared to original position or shift to the left. जैसे reverse also holds true, means the curve shifts to above and to the left, then dissociation becomes difficult. You have to exert more. You have to exert more. कैसे करेंगे आप? यानी lowering the partial pressure of oxygen too much down, below 50. Then you will be able to get oxygen from the hemoglobin. In normal case, to get 50% dissociation, you have to drop partial pressure of oxygen to 25 only, not 50. But in the left and upshifted curve, you have to bring it for 50% dissociation, you need to drop partial pressure to almost 10, which clearly indicates that the left curve, shifting of the curve to the left, makes dissociation difficult. इसके मुकाबले में carbon dioxide transport is a bit easy. Remember, carbon dioxide is brought in 3 or 4 forms: in the dissolved form, in the plasma, which is 7%. 70% is by chemical reactions, or chemical reactions क्या हैं? कि carbon dioxide taken up by the RBCs, and where it combines with water to make carbonic acid, which is further broken down by the carbonic anhydrase to produce hydrogen ions and carbon dioxide.
Sir,
Gee,
the second line they repeat is the down showing decrease in affinity.
all these factors cause increased association. This one,
Yes, sir.
it says that with increased acidity, for example, more hydrogen and proton production, increased temperature, which is because of the increased metabolism, and increased production of the carbon dioxide, which means that increased amount of oxygen is used up. Instead, increased carbon dioxide is produced, and another product, that's a chemical product 2,3-BPG, that is produced. All these cause shift of the curve to the right and down, which means availability of oxygen should be easy now. Dissociation is easy. Association or affinity decreases. Dissociation increases. More oxygen is released. समझ आ गई इंशाल्लाह. I hope.
Sir, last 5 minutes में थोड़ा quick review दे रहे.
जी. फिर बोले
Sir,
बेटा.
थोड़ा quick review दे last 5 minutes. Sir, थोड़ा quick review दे रहे इस topic पर.
अच्छा, जितनी एसिडिटी ज्यादा होगी, मेटाबॉलिज्म ज्यादा होगा, टेम्परेचर ज्यादा होगा, कार्बन डाइऑक्साइड प्रोडक्शन ज्यादा होगी टिश्यू लेवल पे, तो उतना ये ब्लड जो ऑक्सीजन, हेमोग्लोबिन जो ऑक्सीजन ला रहा है, उसकी डिसोसिएशन इतनी इजी होगी, जल्दी जल्दी वो ऑक्सीजन को छोड़ेगा. मींस द कर्व विल शिफ्ट डाउन एंड टू द राइट. जैसे मैंने दरख्त की मिसाल दी कि उसकी टहनियां अगर नीचे आ जाएं टुवर्ड्स यू, to the right, so you can easily manage collection of more fruits. Similarly, यहाँ पे भी आप ये याद रखिए. कार्बन डाइऑक्साइड की मैं बता रहा था कि 70% by chemical reactions and 20% is brought by the hemoglobin. जैसे ऑक्सीजन को ले जाता है हेमोग्लोबिन, इसी तरह कार्बन डाइऑक्साइड को भी ले जाता है. 20% with hemoglobin, 70% is disposed of by chemical reactions, or 7% is the in the dissolved form. आखिर में जल्दी जल्दी मैं आपको बताता हूँ कि हेल्डेन इफेक्ट आप नाम सुनते होंगे, और बोर इफेक्ट का. बोर इफेक्ट एट द लंग लेवल होता है. क्या होता है कि वेयर मोर ऑक्सीजन is available, so it replaces carbon dioxide from the hemoglobin. Oxygen is more in the air that comes to the blood capillaries and pushes its way into the RBC where hemoglobin is situated. और hemoglobin को ये carbon dioxide को kick out करता है because of increased amount of the oxygen एंड कार्बन डाइऑक्साइड को रिप्लेस कर लेता है, ऑक्सीजन उस पे बैठ जाता है. All the pockets are now full with oxygen. और इसके मुकाबले में carbon dioxide dissociation curve is shifted to the right, means carbon dioxide is released from the hemoglobin. So this is the Bohr effect. This is practiced at the lung level. एक दूसरा effect है Haldane effect इसको बोलते हैं, which is practiced at the tissue level. You know that tissue level पे there is more carbon dioxide. So affinity of the hemoglobin, carbon dioxide increases. Hemoglobin जैसे मैंने आपको बताया बहरूपिया की शक्ल इख्तियार कर लेता है, sometimes behaving opposite to what it has behaved at other places. So यहाँ पे it starts loving carbon dioxide and instead releases oxygen, which is better for the tissues. Oxygen is delivered to the tissues, अलबत्ता उसके मुकाबले में वो carbon dioxide को accept कर लेता है. So more oxygen is taken by the lungs. More carbon dioxide is taken by the lungs and more oxygen is delivered to the tissues. Here, oxyhemoglobin diffuses, oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve is shifted to the right. दोनों Haldane effect और Bohr effect एक दूसरे के opposite हैं, लेकिन Haldane effect, which is practiced at the tissue level, that brings the carbon dioxide dissociation curve to the right. So the carbon dioxide is easily released by the hemoglobin. और Bohr effect जो है, that brings the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve to the right by releasing more carbon dioxide and taking oxygen. I hope you have listened properly and understood. Thank you very much. Miss